sun reflected here. Today, I'm going to show you how to fly this beautiful aircraft, the latest DCS world module, the Havilland DH.98 Mosquito. I'm going to show you how to start the engines, taxi, take off, fly, and land. I'm not going to go through each and every step of the official checklist. We're going to look at everything from a more practical point of view. Still, everything you'll hear today is based on the original pilot's notes as well as some more recent in-cockpit videos recorded at air shows. Today, we're going to learn everything you need in order to fly the module properly. You better start practicing now, because I'm already working on an amazing campaign for the Mosquito and the channel map. And you'll be thrown off the deep end, flying the most extraordinary historical and semi-historical missions. So here we are, sitting inside the cockpit, and frankly, my first reaction was, oh, I'm never gonna learn this. There are so many switches and dials and levers and whoa, this looks chaotic and daunting. But if you invest just a little bit of time, you'll realize that it's not that difficult. If you own the Spitfire and you know how to handle it, then it's gonna be quite easy for you. It's like flying two Spitfires at the same time. So let's have a look at starting the engines first. You're sitting here, cold and dark. First thing you got to check is the controls for free, unrestricted movement. All good. Then you have to set the parking brakes. Let me open the controls indicator. If I can find the shortcut, there you are. So if you know the Spitfire, then it's nothing new for you, but if you're used to flying German or American planes, the rudder pedals, they don't have brake axis. The brake is this little lever here. It's like the brake on a bicycle. The more you pull it, the more brake pressure will be applied to the wheels. And there's another catch. The brake pressure will be distributed between the wheels depending on the position of the rudder. So if your rudder is centered, check the controls indicator. Both wheels are braked. But if I apply full right rudder, pull the lever, brake pressure is only applied to the right wheel, and full left rudder, only left wheel. Half left rudder, kind of proportional. See what I mean? This will come handy when we want to taxi. There's one disclaimer here. I have this lever assigned to the right toe brake of my my rudder pedals. If you can, assign it to an axis, because if you use a keyboard shortcut or just a button, check. It goes from 0 to 100% in a split second. And when you're taxiing and you want to turn, you only need to apply this much. And with this button, it's not possible. It's not going to be smooth. Okay? Now let's set the parking brakes. Pull the lever, press that little button, release the brakes, release the button, and brakes are set. Then let's check the supercharger is in the down position. Up is auto, down is low gear. So if it's in auto, then climbing past 7,000 feet, the second gear is going to kick in. But if it's in low gear, the second gear is never going to kick in. So when you're on the ground or at low altitude, you want to have this in the low gear position. Next, we're going to check the throttles for full unrestricted movement. I have these assigned to the throttle axis of my Warthog HOTAS. If you can afford it, if you have enough access, assign it to different axes, because There will be situations where you'll need differential throttles, okay? If you can. If not, there's an option to set both of them to one single axis. Then we check the prop RPM control for full unrestricted movement. I have these assigned to the trim axis on my Warthog hotess. I don't have enough axis, so I have both assigned to the same one. I can live with that because chances are I'm not going to need to have different RPM on the two engines. It's better to have differential throttles. Okay? Then as we move to the right, we set the altimeter to field elevation. A lot of people like to set it to 0, but when you're flying over France, knowing how much higher you are than the ground level at Manston, that information is completely irrelevant. You want to know how high you are compared to the sea level, right? Moving over to the right, we're going to turn on the master switch. This is quite brilliant. When it's off, like this, it shuts off all the magnetos. So let's turn on the master switch. Now we should have power. Let's check. There, at least 24 volts. Good. Now that we have power, we got to check if the bomb doors are closed. Let's lift this cover, and if the lamp is not illuminated, it's closed. The lever is also in the middle position, so bomb doors closed. Now that we have power, we also want to open the radiators. It's not like in the Spitfire, there's no automatic position. It's either open or closed. It's binary. The rule of thumb here is you want them open for all ground ops, engine start, taxiing, takeoff, landing, and you want them open every time that you are using high power settings, so climbing or combat. Only close them when cruising or descending. Or if you want to be more accurate, you can have a look at the radiator temperature gauges. It can run at 105 Celsius forever, 125 Celsius for 1 hour, and 135 for 5 minutes. So that's how you operate the radiators. We're going to leave the air filter off. I would turn it on if it was a dusty environment, like a landing ground in Normandy or something. But we have nice concrete here at Manston, so let's leave the air filter off. Then we have to turn on the fuel selectors. If you can't find them, there's no surprise, because they're behind your seat. So in order to reach them, we've got to move over to the navigator seat and then look back. Here we are, looking back behind the pilot's seat. I'm going to show you what all these switches are for and how to manipulate them, but from now on, later in this tutorial, I'm not going to look at them anymore. I'm going to use keybinds and keyboard shortcuts instead. And I highly recommend you do the same. Either learn the default keybinds for all of these, or come up with your own. Whatever feels logical to you, whatever you can easily access during flight. Because in flight, especially during combat, you can't switch seats, turn around, and try to hit these with your mouse. Especially not if you have suboptimal head tracking like I do. That's just not feasible, not an option. So use keyboard shortcuts, underlined 3 exclamation marks. First, let's take a look at these red buttons. These are the engine cutouts. You stop the engines by pulling them out until the propeller stops. Obviously, they need to be pushed in for engine start and flight. Below them, you'll find the fuel selectors, one for each side. They're in the off position now, pointing up. By default, in the Mosquito, there are 2 fuel tanks in each wing. You can either select the outer wing tanks, like this, or the inner wing tanks. The way you manage this is you start your engines on the outer wing tanks, warm up on the inner wing tanks, and take off and land using whichever tanks have more fuel, just to be safe. There's a catch though. By default, only the inner wing tanks are pressurized. The outer tanks are not. It's not recommended to use them at high altitudes where vaporization can cause the engines to cut out. Also, they're not recommended to be used at very low altitudes either. It's because their capacity is much smaller than the inner tanks, and the fuel gauge is not very reliable when approaching empty. The needles are kind of bouncy, and you don't want the engines to stop when you're flying at 10 feet over enemy territory. So keep these in mind. For engine start, we need the outer wing tanks now. Above them, you'll find the fuel tank pressurizer, or as the manual calls it, the pressure venting cock. Turn this on before engine start to pressurize the inner wing tanks, and leave it on for the whole mission. Unless you have extra long-range tanks in the bomb bay, but more on that later. Last but not least, this is the fuel transfer pump. This is on, this is off. The name is a little bit misleading. Its sole purpose is to transfer fuel from the external drop tanks. Those are attached to the wings, connected to the outer wing tanks. So when you want to use them, switch the selectors to the outer tanks and then turn on the transfer pump. It will transfer fuel from the drop tanks to the outer wing tanks. When it's on, it also pressurizes the outer wing tanks, so you can use them at high altitudes too. Again, there's a catch. You'll need to make space for that fuel first. You need the outer tanks to be nearly empty before you can use the drop tanks. If they are not, the transfer pump will quickly fill the outer tanks, and from then on, the contents of your drop tanks will be just vented into the atmosphere, and you will make it back from Berlin. Okay, all set here. Let's move back to our seat. From here on, I'll operate these using keybinds. Okay, everything is set. We're ready to start the engine. Let's correct the throttles, 1/2 inch, prop control, fully forward, brake set. And now in a Spitfire, you would start priming the engines. No primer. Why is that? It's because the primers are installed outside of the cockpit on the engine nacelles. So you've got to have your ground crew standing there and vigorously priming the engine while you are starting it. And they're standing right here. It says primer pump inside, not to be screwed in tight after use. On older models, the primer pump was right here on the outside, but on this later model, they moved it inside the wheel well, I think, which was a smart move because look where we are. We're looking straight up the exhaust pipes of the Merlin engine. And if you've seen videos of Merlin engines being started, you know there's a whole lot of flames and smoke involved, and I sure as hell wouldn't want to stand right here when that happens. I assume all ground crews were bald and their hair burnt off. But this is how it worked. First-rate British engineering. So we want to ask the poor blokes to prime the engine, but they cannot hear us for now, so we have to open the side window and ask them nicely. So radio menu, ground crew, start priming engines.
From the starter. Copy.
Okay, let's turn on the magnetos for the left engine. You can start whichever engine you want first. Actually, the pilot's notes recommends to alternate. So one day you start the left first and then the right, so that you can check and verify that each engine-driven hydraulic pump is working. Let's start the left one first. Magnetos on. And then this looks familiar from the Spitfire. There's a starter switch and a booster coil. Let's flip the covers. The starter switch will start turning the propeller around, and the booster coil will provide extra voltage to the spark plugs. Make sure the engine starts. I'm going to use keyboard shortcuts. I love keyboard shortcuts. I don't like clicking buttons with the mouse, especially because of my crappy head tracking. So I'm going to press the starter and the booster coil at the same time. The engine catches. I release both buttons and stabilize the RPM at 1200. That's your idle. Now we can start the right engine. You don't have to ask the ground crew again. We're going to use a slightly different technique that I've seen in airshow videos, and not only Mosquito videos, but Corsair, Mustang. So the thing is, if the aircraft is sitting on the ground for a long time, all the oil in the engine will, gravity will pull it down. And when your engine starts, you want perfect lubrication. So you want to start moving that oil around before the engine catches. So what we're going to do is open the covers. I'm going to press the starter switch, let the propeller rotate for a couple of blades to start that oil moving, and then I'm going to switch on the magnetos and press the booster coil while keeping the starter depressed. Okay, let's see how it works. So, starter, let's count a few blades, mags on, booster coil, engine catches, release both, 1200 RPM, and the engines are running. Now that we are not draining the battery anymore, we can turn on all the gadgets and stuff. The compass, the radio, set it to whichever channel the tower is set to in the mission. This little thingy is quite useful because if you fly at night, these lights are very bright and they are reflected on the canopy, and that's quite annoying. So you can dim the lights at night. Just keep it in mind, it's useful. Also, you can set the cockpit lights. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 little knobs or rheostats or whatever you call them, useful for night missions. There's also another one here for the navigator. Then let's move on over here. A couple of switches. Let's turn on the gun camera, nav light if you want, UV light if you want, pitot heat. It's always a good idea if you want to keep your airspeed indicator and your instruments. Fuel pump. This can be misleading. If you're used to flying Spitfires and other warbirds, you want to turn these on. But you remember I told you about a fuel pump already, or the pressure venting cock. This fuel pump here is only for the long-range tanks. So optionally, you can have 2 long-range fuel tanks installed inside the bomb bay. And if you have those, and you want to use those, use the fuel inside them, then you turn on the fuel pump. But then, you also have to turn off the pressure venting cock. Okay? But we do not have long-range tanks now, so let's turn this off. Reflector gun sight. By default, if you turn it on, your head position will be moved here. I have turned this off in the special settings because, thank you very much, I can move my own head, and I found it a bit strange to have my head moved here. So you can go to your settings, special, Mosquito, and then select whatever behavior you want. So that's it, the engine is running, but remember, For engine warm-up, you want to use the inner wing tanks. So I'm going to reach back behind my back and move the fuel selectors to point inwards. I just pressed the keyboard shortcuts, and so should you, because switching seats and looking behind you is really not an option. So let's wait until the engine warms up. You want at least 15 degrees of oil temperature and at least 40 degrees of radiator temperature. Basically as soon as the needle starts moving, but it looks alright because it's a warm day. If it's a cold day, you're going to have to wait quite a bit, and then you can accelerate the warm-up process by applying as much power as you can without having too high of an oil pressure, and then press the oil dilution buttons also behind your seat, so you want a shortcut for those as well. Okay, we're good to go. It's time to taxi. Let's release the parking brakes. Just pull on it, release, and off we go. As soon as the aircraft starts rolling, throttle back to 800-900 RPM. The most common mistake when taxiing warbirds is taxiing too fast. It's so much harder to control. Now, have a look at this. Full right rudder, full left rudder, nothing. Nothing is happening. It's because the rudder is very small, and also it has no airflow, no prop wash going over it, because it's not behind the engines. So you want to use differential braking. It's full right rudder, gentle tap on the brake, and the nose starts turning right. You can help it with differential throttle too. It's better to have several gentle taps on the brake instead of one more drastic pull. If you want to stop the nose from turning, opposite rudder and some more gentle taps. Right rudder, right brake, left rudder, left brake, and we're taxiing straight. Now the forward visibility is way better than a single engine aircraft like the Spitfire. So you don't really have to use S-turns when taxiing, which is great. See, I'm throttling back to 900, 800 RPM. That's plenty enough. You don't want to go faster than this, otherwise it will be kind of hard to control. I've also heard that in real life there is a delay between the braking effect and pulling the lever. So that must make it really difficult to taxi with such a system. We're going to taxi all the way to the end of the runway, because in aviation there's no such thing as too much runway ahead of you. Let's throttle back a little further. Beautiful Manston. By the way, in my campaign, you will be based at Manston. You will need this huge concrete runway when coming back from night missions. Those are going to be the best. Okay, let's stop here. Set the parking brakes. So pull, press the button, release the button. Close the window. Now we're going to check the engines. This is not necessary in DCS, not really, because every time you spawn, you get a brand new aircraft. It surely has no problems, but it's realistic. It's, you know, for the sake of immersion, let's do it. So open one of the throttles to 0 boost. Then let's exercise the prop control. The RPM drops, goes back up to the same value. Check again. All good. Now let's check the magnetos. Each engine has 2 ignition circuits. In case one fails, the other one is a backup. So we got to make sure they work separately. So let's turn on the left magneto, and the RPM drop shouldn't exceed 50. That means the right circuit works on its own. Let's check the other way around. Left one works. The drop is not more than 50. Let's throttle back to 1200. Good. Other engine. 0 boost. Prop control. Works nice. Magnetos. Let's check the drop. Again, I'm not clicking these magnetos. I'm using keyboard shortcuts. Okay, let's throttle back. For takeoff, let's trim the aircraft. Aileron trim, neutral. Rudder trim, slightly starboard, so to the right. If the needle is pointing to the T, that should be fine. Next, let's check the elevator trim. If the aircraft is not heavily loaded, you don't have a whole lot of fuel and or bombs, then 1 division nose down trim will suffice. However, if the aircraft is heavily loaded, you have bombs, the tanks are full, like we are today, we're heavy, I'm going to need 1.5 division of nose down trim. It's because with a heavy aircraft, you will need flaps for takeoff. And flaps will cause the nose to pitch up. And you want to counter it with trim. Speaking about flaps, this is the flap lever. There's a safety lock. Again, not going to click it. I already have keyboard shortcuts. And this is the flap gauge. So you want, if your aircraft is heavy, like we are today, you want 15 degrees of flaps. So you move it down, and when it reaches 15, you move it back to the middle position. That's it. We've got 15 degrees of flap. And the last item of the takeoff checklist, I've heard it in a video, is to ask all the termites to hold hands and pray. Okay, let's take the runway. Release the brakes, add a little power until we're rolling. Let's turn onto the runway. Remember what I said about fuel management. You want to take off and land on the fullest tanks. Let's line up with the runway. Roll forward a little bit until the tail wheel is straight, and then stop. Because the tail wheel moves freely, like in a Spitfire. It's not controlled by the rudder. It cannot be locked. Let's check the fuel. Outer tanks, I can't see the number, but like 50 or 60 gallons. Inner tanks over 100, so we're going to be using the inner tanks. I'm switching over to the inner tanks using the keyboard shortcut. So the takeoff roll. The thing about the Mosquito is that the propellers, they don't counter rotate. They rotate in the same direction, which will want to make the aircraft veer to the left. So there's going to be a left yaw momentum as you apply power. And at low speeds, the rudder will not work at all. Also, when the tail comes up, because of the gyroscopic forces, once again, the aircraft will want to yaw left. So you have to counter it somehow. How do you do that? You can use differential braking, but I would not recommend it. Instead, I'm going to open the throttle with the stick fully back to 0 boost. And when I release the brakes, I'm going to apply more power to the left engine than the right one. I'm going to lead with the left and then follow with the right one, like this. After a couple of takeoff runs, you'll get the hang of it. I haven't gotten the hang of it yet, you will see. So 0 boost, release the brakes, and increase power. Stick slightly forward. You don't need full power for takeoff. 12 inches should suffice. Keep it straight, keep it down. At 120, the aircraft rotates. We're airborne, but keep the nose down. Pull the brake to stop the wheel from moving, and raise the landing gear. Keep the nose down, let it accelerate to 170 miles per hour, which is safety speed. It's also the best climb speed. So should you have engine failure, you could still put it down on the runway. We reached 170, raise the nose and keep it at 170. We've reached a safety altitude, so we can raise the flaps. Be prepared that the aircraft will nose down once the flaps are raised. And we can also throttle back to climb setting to 9 boost, plus 9 boost, and then 2850 RPM. When you throttle down, always start with the throttles and then follow it with the RPM. Likewise, when you add power, always increase the RPM first and then the throttle to keep the cylinders from detonating. Basically, the rule of thumb here is you don't want to use low RPM with high boost. So we're at climb settings, plus 9 and 2850. We climb at 170 miles per hour. Retrim the aircraft as required. If we had our air filter on our dusty runway, we could turn it off now. And as you climb, if you switch, I've told you this before, but if you switch the supercharger to auto at 7,000 feet, the second gear will kick in, but the manual says keep it in low gear until the maximum obtainable boost falls to 7. Also, as you climb to higher altitudes, don't forget to turn on the oxygen here and here behind the stick. Otherwise, you will have a bad day. If you don't want to climb, then you can throttle back to cruise settings, plus 7 boost and 2650 RPM. And at these settings, we can already close the radiators and we're good to go. Okay, here we are coming back from a successful mission. We've bombed Gestapo headquarters at Copenhagen. Let's set up for landing. The airfield is over there. So you want to select the fuel tank that has more fuel. Well, our outer wing tanks are full at about 50, inner tanks 40, so the outer tanks have more fuel now, so I'm going to switch to those. We've got to open the radiators for landing and increase RPM to 2850. Today we're going to do a World War II style approach. So the way they did it was overfly the runway at very low altitude but also high speed in order to have high energy. And from that they could pull up and turn downwind. I've heard that this is because the engines were not as reliable as today, and in case of an engine failure, they had the energy to have options. When you fly, you always want to have several options. If you only have one option left, you're doing something wrong. Low pass, high speed, wave to the ground crew. And now let's pull up and to the right. That shrieking noise is the landing gear warning horn. So if the throttles are behind a certain point, you're going to hear this if the landing gear is not down. It's probably the most annoying sound I've ever heard. Let's turn downwind at about 1,000 feet. Never mind the altimeter, I forgot to set it. And as you slow down 200 miles per hour, you can lower the flaps, but not fully, just 15 to 20 degrees to help us slow down. We hit 180, you can lower the landing gear and get rid of this annoying sound. And as we turn onto final, you want to keep the speed at 150. From here on, you control your speed with the elevators and your altitude and glide slope with the throttles. So if you're too high, don't push the nose forward, but decrease power instead. Put the throttles back a bit. If you're slow, like we are now, lower the nose a little bit to let it accelerate. And 150 is our magic number because that's the maximum allowable speed with the flaps fully down. They're slightly low, so I'm increasing power. We also did a very wide turn now. For a more tactical approach, you can turn, start your turn exactly when you're abeam, and then straighten out just as you cross the threshold. We're on final at 150. Let's lower the flaps fully. The aircraft will nose up. Let's counter it with trim, and let's bleed the airspeed to 120. That's your approach speed. Unless you're heavily loaded, then you can add 5 to 10 miles per hour. And again, control your glide slope with the throttle. You can go for a 3-pointer or a 2-pointer. I really want to learn how to do the 2-pointer properly. Fly just above the runway, cut the throttle, keep it off, keep it off. Oh, it wasn't so nice. Stick fully back and be prepared to dance on the rudder. So as soon as the nose starts moving in one direction, apply full rudder in the opposite direction, but don't leave it there for too long, otherwise you will overcorrect. Don't use the brakes just yet. We're down to taxi speed. We can start using channel taps on the brakes. See the control indicator. I'm not pulling full brakes. We're down. Propeller fully forward. Flaps up. And let's taxi off the runway. Roger that. Let's open the window. Get some fresh air. Okay, here we are back at our original parking position. So first we gotta set the parking brakes. So pull the lever, press the button, release the lever, release the button. And idle at 1200 RPM. And before we shut down the engines, we want to turn off all the electronic systems, because once the engines stop, they're gonna be using the battery, draining the battery, and we want our battery to have a long life. So compass, radio, gun camera, pitot heat, reflector sight off. Now we can shut down the engines. According to the manual, you've got to idle at 1200 RPM, then pull out the engine cutout buttons behind the seat. Remember those red buttons that I showed you before engine start. So you pull them out and It cuts the fuel flow to the engines and they will stop. But I'm going to do it slightly differently. I've seen this technique in airshow videos, and also I've been taught to stop engines this way in real life. Sadly, not flying Mosquitoes. So what I'm going to do, you know, when you idle for a long time, lead from the fuel can accumulate on the spark plugs and they can be fouled. They're not going to work. So before we stop the engines, we're going to throttle up to, let's say, 2000 RPM just for a couple of seconds to burn off the accumulated lead from the spark plugs. And then we're going to pull out the engine cutout buttons. So let's do that. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's pull out the cutouts. The engine stop. As the RPM drops, I'm opening the throttles all the way to get some fuel into the cylinders, so next time they start more easily. Propeller stopped, throttle back, and we can turn off the magnetos, all of them. Then we have to reach behind our seat and push back the engine cutouts. Then we can turn off the pressure venting cock and turn off the fuel selectors. Before shutting down the master switch, we close the radiators, and then we turn off the master switch. Now we can contact the ground crew to place the wheel chocks.
Chief, place the wheel chocks. Copy. Wheel chocks are now in place.
They are in place, so we can release the parking brakes. That's it, we're good to go. Let's open the side door. We can climb out of the aircraft, sling our Irvin jacket over our shoulder, and go see the squadron intelligence officer for debrief. Okay, that's it. It wasn't too difficult, was it? I hope you enjoyed the video and managed to learn something new today. Now you know how to operate this beautiful aircraft properly. My new favorite DCS module. I love all DCS warbirds, but then ED really raised the bar with the P-47. But now they absolutely knocked it out of the park with the Mosquito. I can't wait for other features to be implemented so that I can finish my new campaign and share it with you. So stay tuned. There's a lot of Mossie content coming in the next months, so make sure you subscribe. See ya!